In the mysterious and perilous world of werewolves, the protagonist Kyra struggles to survive amidst the tense relationships with the two powerful alphas, Osriel and Zion. But when an unexpected ally appears, revealing Kyra's potential unique ability, how will her fate change? Can she harness this newfound power, or will it be her undoing? Explore the unknown, subscribe to Kyra's adventure. Chapter 32. After my argument with Osriel, the silence of the infirmary had become unbearable. I only lasted a few hours before I demanded Dr. Herschel permit me back to my chambers, which after much convincing he relented to. I was lying on my bed, kicking my legs up idly when a knock sounded at my door. I had been so consumed by thought that I hadn't heard it the first time, and it was only the second knock that caught my attention. I wondered who would want to see me now, after everything that had happened. My organs liquefied. What if Zion was behind that door, getting ready for another round of tongue-lashing? Or what if it was Osriel, bearing news that I must leave the pack immediately? You deserved the latter, I thought miserably. When the knock sounded again, I got up, shuffling towards the door. I figured there was no point in delaying my doom. I palmed the knob, its cold tantalizing touch doing nothing to calm my racing heart. Slowly, I opened the door, surprised to find who was waiting there. My jaw dropped. Raina. I sputtered, gawking at the golden-haired girl in disbelief. She nodded, looking slightly confused by my reaction. I thought you had been sent to the outpost with the others. Her green eyes widened momentarily before she shook her head, with a regretful sigh. Not me, she muttered. I've been selected to stay in the court. It means that she trailed off, swallowing. It was luck of the draw. Omegas and thetas are often made to rotate about the territory in our lifetime, we rarely come back to the court. I guess I was lucky to be chosen to remain here for now at least. I nodded, eyes stinging. I blinked back my tears, stepping aside to let Raina in. She nodded, and by the way she stared at the ground, I wondered if she was holding back her own tears too. For a while, we stood in silence. There was a certain heaviness in the air, a crippling sadness that wrung my gut painfully. Unable to take it, I sat at the foot of my bed, plastering a fake smile to my face as I regarded Raina. I assume you heard. Raina nodded, smiling despite the sadness in her eyes. Yes, I heard. The whole court knows. I bit the inside of my cheek, and Raina glanced down again. I hadn't forgotten the wary stares that had been sent my way during my trek to this room. I had gotten so used to everyone's kindling acceptance, that it gave me whiplash being stared at like an alien again. Not only had I destroyed my relationships with the two most powerful men here, but I had ruined my reputation as well. I think you did the right thing, Raina muttered. I glanced up, shocked. Azure deserved it, she continued, holding my gaze this time. She needed to be put in her place. She treats everyone like dirt, especially us Omegas. I'm glad you handed her ass to her, I really am. If it weren't for the determined gleam in her eyes, I may have just thought she'd been saying it to make me feel better. I simply nodded, staring at my clasped hands. Silence ensued again. Did you fall out with Zion? And Osriel, I added. Raina gawked at me. What? She stammered. What happened? I shook my head, rubbing at the ache in my temples. I got too carried away with my words, I explained, trying my all to fight the tightness in my throat. I was angry, and I accidentally upset him. I really didn't mean it. I stopped, bottom lip quivering. Raina quickly rushed to my side and rubbed the small of my back. He'll forgive you in good time, Kyra, Raina assured quietly. You just need to give him space. Alphas have a lot of stresses, and they break sometimes, too. I snorted. Yeah, in maybe 100 years he'll forgive me. Raina smiled. That's fine. We live far longer than 100 years. I turned to look at her, eyes wide. We? She paused, before bursting out into laughter. The noise itself was enough to quell the miserable storm within me, just a bit. No one ever told you. I furrowed my brows, shaking my head. Raina giggled. Us werewolves live for much longer than any human does, Kyra. I thought your human television shows would have told you that. My eyes widened. How long? She shrugged. 250 years, give or take. But that's just for us red-blooded wolves. True alphas live for much longer. How much longer? She shrugged again. It varies. They are semi-immortal, so anywhere from 600 to 800 years. I gawked. And how old's Osriel? Oh, he's young. Only 350. Young? Then why does everyone look like they are in their 20s? I asked, aghast. Raina shifted in her seat. I assume you mean we look like humans in their 20s. We age much differently from humans. You see, werewolf age is categorized in 3 ways: pre-prime, prime and post-prime. I, for example, am pre-prime. She motioned to herself. I look younger than many other werewolves here, and that's because I'm only 15. The next stage is prime, which would be you, Lord Osriel, Lord Zion. But how? I stammered. How can I be in the same category, when they are so much older than me? Because they are not, Raina explained. Well, maybe in the mathematic sense, yes, but in the werewolf world, a prime 100-year-old wolf is considered just as old as a prime 18-year-old wolf. I nodded, though not fully understanding it. And what about post-prime? They are our elders, she explained. Though you may not see many of them. You see, once a wolf exceeds a certain age, it will begin to rapidly age, usually at around the 240 mark. At that point, they are considered elders. I blinked. So a werewolf only spends most of their life as a prime. Raina nodded. Correct. I gazed at the wall, trying to take in all this new information. Raina seemed humoured by my dumbfounded reaction. Do you know what a mate is? She asked, poking me in the side. I gave her a sideways glance. I'd heard of werewolf mating, at least in werewolf shows and books. I wasn't sure if the same applied here. I think so, though I can't say I'm fluent in the topic. Raina gave me a half-smile. What do you think they are? I pondered. Well, in the books, mates are 2 werewolves destined to be together. They would do this weird marking thing, and a werewolf could only ever have one mate. And they could sense their mate upon meeting them. Oh, and a moon goddess chooses the mates. Raina barked a laugh. That's what they tell you. What kind of sappy romance shit is that? And a moon goddess? Please, I frowned as Raina continued to giggle, slightly disgruntled. Then what are they? Well, Raina began. A mate is, as you said, someone you're destined to be with. But that's where similarities end. The first difference is that it is possible for a werewolf to have multiple mates. I raised my brows. Multiple mates. She nodded. And sometimes, in unfortunate cases, someone may be mated to someone who isn't mated back to them. Those are known as dud mates, and are often the cause of many heartbreaks. It's not as uncommon as you'd like to think. I scowled. What other differences are there? Well, that thing you said about a wolf knowing their mate as soon as they meet them, it's not quite how it works. Mate attraction is developed over time, and it is only a certain point in the development in which one can sense another as their mate. I nodded. So like a surprise egg. She gave me an exasperated look. Yeah, like a surprise egg, whatever that is, she added with a snort. We continued to talk about werewolves and mates and other jazz. Turns out Raina was much more of a romantic than I initially thought, and she seemed to go doe-eyed and dreamy every time I mentioned the word mate. Before long, the sun had sunk below the horizon, and it was time for Raina to do her palace chores. I felt a strange sadness wash over me as she stepped off my bed. Once her hand was on the door, she paused, turning to look at me. "Don't feel so put out, Kyra," she said quietly. "Everything will get better in good time, trust me." I nodded, and though I felt slightly lifted by Raina's kind words, I couldn't help but feel that things weren't going to get better. In fact, I had the sinking suspicion that they'd only get worse. Chapter 33 W. Anxiety Attack. Raina had assured me everything would get better, but, if I'm honest, it only got worse. I knew I had screwed up, just not quite to the degree I expected. I noticed the first change right as the next feasting began. The hall fell silent as I entered, eyes regarding me with anything from fear to concern to outright hatred. It was like a kick to the skull, and with cold dread, I realized my reputation was back to square one. I wasn't welcome at the theater table, and not even the Omegas wanted me. The Omegas that had gained some degree of respect for me over the months had lost it all overnight. Now, they simply glared my way in warning, their distaste obvious. I'd looked towards Zion and Osriel for guidance. Of course, Zion was simply scowling at me, and Osriel wouldn't even look my way. As though to add salt to the wound, Zion had stood up and reported that 2 of the territory's outposts had fallen to enemy wolves. Not only had they slaughtered our kin, but they were quite literally expanding into our territory. Nervous murmurs had risen from the crowd, but I simply flushed with rage. I knew that had been directed at me. The higher-ups never divulged reports, not in front of everyone. He'd done it so I could hear, so he could remind me of how little progress I'd made in the grand scheme of things. At this rate, I'll never save the court, I thought sadly. Or these people. I'd looked around me, noting the glares and dirty looks that were sent my way. Then again, do these people even deserve my saving? I'd thought bitterly. I'd quickly pushed the thought away. I couldn't allow these toxic attitudes to leak into my own mind, I had to stay true to myself. After his little speech, I'd returned to my room as quickly as I could, biting back my tears of frustration. Raina had come in a little later with food since I'd left without eating, and promised me that if I wanted to eat in my quarters from now on, she would deliver. After much coercion, I finally agreed. But I couldn't hide forever. Next up came the group training. Zion was harder on me than usual, yelling in my ear with every opportunity he got. It was like when I'd first joined. This time, however, it wasn't birthed from good intent, from his desire for me to succeed. No, he attacked me out of pure spite. And yet I couldn't blame him. How could I after everything I'd done? Everyone glared at me the whole time. Even when I couldn't see their eyes, I could feel their hostile intent beaming into me, weighing me down. Azure in particular. Hell, she glared at me as though willing lasers to shoot through her eyes. To my surprise, though, she said nothing, not once. Zion had declined a private session, and though I was thankful, I couldn't help but feel deeply hurt. I got back to my room, flopped onto my bed, and cried well into the night. The next day I didn't leave my room at all. Or the day after. Or the day after that. No one checked up on me aside from Raina, who would deliver me food and kind words. I humored her by trying to look somewhat present, but in reality, I was far from it. I was lost in my head, so lost. About a week had passed and still no appearance from the beta or alpha. I was starting to think they didn't care about me at all. That was until a loud knock sounded at the door one day, followed by a large crash, as it was forced open. There, panting at its frame, was Zion. His auburn hair was disheveled, green eyes caught with something between concern and anger. For many moments, We sat in silence, staring each other down. As always, he was the first to break that silence. I swear, Epsilon, if you sulk around in this room one day longer, I will have you thrown out the court. He yelled. When I didn't respond, he continued. You know, Epsilon, I didn't pin you as the type to wallow in their own self-pity. Even when you were at your lowest, you would keep fighting. But now. He made erratic hand motions, gesturing to my crumpled form on the bed. Now you've just given up. I didn't respond. This only seemed to anger him more. Look around you. He snapped, gesturing to the white walls and polished floors, the velvet furniture, and golden ornaments. You're living like a fucking princess, and yet here you are feeling sorry for yourself over one mistake you made. I kept my eyes firmly to my lap, my fists balling. Zion, of course, took it as a sign of defiance. Well, do you think I'm wrong? He asked, exasperated. Tell me if I'm wrong. By all means, correct me. I gritted my teeth. My body began to tremble. Pathetic, he snarled. Here you go again, taking everything for granted. I'm sorry, I stammered, my whisper barely audible despite the silence of the room. Zion stilled. Pardon. He said, deathly quiet. I'm sorry, I choked. Zion fell silent. Through blurred vision I watched tears fall upon the clenched fists in my lap. I know, I continued, voice shaking. I know that I'm hopeless. I know I'm a burden to this court, a screw-up. I bit my fist mouth as I sobbed. Deep, guttural sobs. I'd bottled up a week worth of anguish, and the dam was beginning to break. Zion simply stood there, watching my breakdown. I couldn't make out his expression through my blurred vision. He was probably angry at me for crying, for being so weak, but I couldn't help it. I'm sorry, I whispered. For letting you down. You tried so hard to let me fit in. And yet I gasped, clutching my chest. It felt as though my heart had been stabbed, the dagger twisting with every painful word. I could feel myself pulling away from reality, losing myself to the turbulent vortex in my head pulling me under, drowning me. I could hear their harsh words, feel their cold stares, and at that moment I felt like the loneliest person in the world. I'm sorry. I gasped through the tightness in my throat, hoping someone, anyone would hear me amidst this ocean of loneliness. I'm sorry. I bit back my sobs. It was all too much. The judgmental stares, the losses of friendships, the decaying state of my mind as I'd rotted away in this room, the hatred that radiated from almost every being. Even now, I could feel Zion's distaste, his judgment. I was just a fragile piece of glass, and I was cracking. My hands shook violently. I swallowed as my skin iced over, my lungs tightening to the point of implosion. In that moment everything around me felt so dark and so cold, as though I'd been dunked in icy waters. I wheezed as I struggled to draw in air, my heart thundering in my ears. It pounded painfully against my chest, and I groaned as I doubled over. Kyra! Zion yelled, barreling towards me. Through my doubled vision, I saw him kneel before me, green eyes laced with concern. Breathe, Kyra. I continued to gasp, opening and closing my mouth in an attempt to draw in air, yet nothing passed through the tightness in my throat. Tears ran down my cheeks as my mind became further and further lost within its icy panic. I could feel that strange power rising in response, but the fear was simply too overwhelming, smothering the flame like a damp cloth. My vision started to dwindle. Zion grasped my hands, eyes wide with desperation. Breath, Kyra, breathe. I fell forward, shuddering uncontrollably as I hit his shoulder. My head lolled around uselessly as he scooped me up into his arms, my body quivering against his chest. I continued to wheeze, straining for air, for oxygen. I'm going to die, I thought as black dots flitted in my vision. I'm going to die and no one will remember me. Help! I heard Zion yell, though his voice was distant. Medical. Then, everything faded into darkness. Chapter 34. I don't know how much time passed. I was just thankful for the soft lull of warmth that engulfed me as I came around, the familiar plushness of mattress and blankets. I opened my eyes and blinked, staring quizzically at the bed's gossamer canopy. I couldn't quite recall what's happened, or how I'd ended up so snugly in my bed. All I knew was that my lungs hurt, and I felt extremely tired. "You awake?" squeaked a familiar voice. Slowly, I turned my head, eyes widening. "Raina." The girl gave me a grave nod, her emerald eyes torn between caution and relief, as she set down a silver tray. There were many goodies on it: sweets, cakes, orange juices. Looking at it made my mouth water, but at the same time, the thought of eating made me nauseous. She followed my gaze. "Osriel sent you those," she muttered. "He visited a little while ago." I frowned. Osriel visiting me and sending me food. After everything I'd done to offend him. "Raina, what's going on?" The blonde hesitated. "You had an anxiety attack and passed out," she informed me. "Zion was near hysterics. He thought you were dying." "And Osriel, he..." Her voice trailed off, mouth falling shut. Her eyes darkened. "He?" I prompted. Raina swallowed. "He was furious." The room spun. I opened my mouth to ask why, but it seemed the girl was already a step ahead. After Zion had told him what had happened, what you'd said, he'd called everyone to adjourn at the dining hall. He stood before us all, and Kyra, she shook her head, leveling her gaze with mine. "Kyra, I've never seen him so angry. He looked about ready to tear someone in two." I swallowed. I could never imagine Osriel holstering such wrath. "He yelled at us, saying that we all ought to get our act together and treat you with some respect. He warned us that, from this point forward, no one is to treat you with any form of disrespect, not so much as look at you the wrong way. He told us that if he heard a peep of someone breaking the rule, he wouldn't hesitate to throw them out the court." My heart dropped. Throw them out of the court. For my sake. It didn't make sense. "But why?" I asked, voice barely audible over the wind whistling through my window. Raina let out a long breath. "Something snapped in him, Kyra. I'm no psychological expert, but I think just seeing how the court's treatment had affected you. It broke him. He's not been himself since." Raina shrugged, trying to feign indifference. But nothing could mask that darkness in her eyes. She was deeply disturbed, and I could understand why. Osriel had always been a peaceful, calm-spoken leader. For him to lash out on the entire court like that. For my sake. Something deep within me stirred at the thought, a strong emotion I couldn't quite pin. I dismissed it. I recalled what he'd told me weeks ago, how he had only so much control over the court. Had he lied? And if so, why? I turned to look at Raina. She looked on the verge of tears now, biting her bottom lip to the point it blanched. Maybe he hasn't lied. Maybe he was telling the truth. He could only control his court to a certain extent if he used peaceful methods. If he really wanted to control them, he could use his wrath, and when he did, this was the result. I cleared my throat, not quite knowing what to say. But Osriel hates me now. It certainly wasn't that, and I wished I could take the words back when Raina gave me a bemused look, almost impatient look. "What? Kyra, have you gone mad? He does not hate you, not one bit." "But we argued a week ago," I stammered. "I upset him. After that, he hadn't even bothered to look my way, and I fell silent, hating the sting in my eyes. I hated how Osriel's silence had affected me so much. God, I was nothing to him, so why should he mean so much to me? Raina shook her head, golden locks cascading across her shoulders with the motion. You're wrong, Kyra, was all she said, standing to leave. Once she reached the door, she stopped, half turning to face me. Osriel will be visiting again. Prepare for his visit. Her voice was deadpan cold, almost. Before I could ask her what was wrong, she left. Chapter 35. I sat up in my bed for ages, staring at the door. My ears strained for the slightest hint of oncoming footsteps, for any signs of Osriel's approach. My stomach was a mess of knots, and if that intense waiting were to drag on any longer, I would surely throw up Raina's strawberry tart. What would I say to Osriel when he came in? What would he say? Was I forgiven for what I'd done, or would we talk about that, too? I shuddered. My eyelids felt heavy, and my body still ached from my sudden surge of panic. I wanted to sleep. I didn't want to debate the Alpha's forgiveness, or a thing about anyone, for that matter. Just then, a knock sounded at the door. I shot upright, my gut twisting as I prepared for the worst. Come in. I quavered, dreading whoever stood behind that door. Slowly, the wood creaked open, and I prepared myself for the piercing gaze of azure eyes. Instead, I was met with a pair of emeralds, an undeniable light of concern within them. As they honed in on me, they flooded in relief, a small smile meeting the man's pink lips. His long auburn hair glinted in the light, a contrast to the black suit and dress pants he wore. Zion. I muttered quietly. He nodded, and it took me a moment to realize he hadn't scolded me for not using his proper title. Okay, something's up. With haste, the man closed the distance between us. Shock leveled through me as the male approached my bedside. Are you okay, KY? He paused, throat bobbing. Epsilon. I nodded. As though things couldn't get any weirder, Zion extended his hand, palpating the skin on my forehead. The back of his hand felt warm and soft, and part of me felt dizzy when he finally took it away. We sat in silence for a few moments. Zion wrung his hands, his emerald gaze darting wildly about the room, all the while avoiding mine. It took me a moment to recognize the emotion in his eye to be nervousness. The realization made me still, but I didn't have much time to mull over it as he opened his mouth to speak again. I'm sorry for coming in here so harshly the other day, he muttered. I didn't mean. I didn't think. He fell silent, a soft frown crumpling his features. Shame burned away in his gaze as he stared at the floor. Though I was shocked by Zion's behavior, I was even more shocked by my own when I reached out and grabbed his arm. His gaze snapped to mine, his face mirroring mine. It wasn't your fault, I mumbled, holding his gaze. You were just trying to lift me out that state. You were just trying to do what you thought was right. I see that now. The male's throat bobbed. His eyes were full of an emotion I couldn't quite decipher, but before I could, he looked down. Abruptly, he jerked his arm and turned away, and for a fleeting moment, I worried that I'd upset him. Osriel will be here soon, he muttered, striding towards the door. His voice was deadpan, cold, and it had me wondering if I'd simply imagined all those emotions passing through his gaze. He wishes to speak with you. In haste, he wound out the door and shut it fast behind him. I swallowed. Had I'd upset him? But if I'd done something to make him mad, he'd surely have let me know, right? What he'd done was very unlike him. I didn't have much time to ponder, though, for just mere moments later another knock sounded at the door, and this one sounded more authoritative. Shit. Chapter 36. Come in. I squeaked, scrambling to organize the rampant thoughts in my head. I had to just deal with a moody werewolf, and now I'd have to deal with another one. And who knew what mood Osriel would be in? The door flew open. An involuntary gasp ripped from my throat. The man at the frame was Osriel, sure enough, but he looked unrecognizable. His skin was paler than usual, a grey undertone that took away the ethereal glow. His dark hair was dull and dishevelled, kinked at the ends as though he'd spent the past hour pulling at the strands. His clothes were a crumpled mess, his black pelter creased and folded. But that was nothing compared to his stare. Immediately I was locked within his gaze, stomach clenching as an iciness ran through me. His blue eyes looked almost grey, their charming gleam nowhere to be seen. Instead, it was replaced by a foreign dullness, the sodden remains of a guttered flame. He looked at me with a kind of hopelessness that stole the breath from my lungs, a hopelessness that made its way into my own heart. His eyes widened as he regarded me. Neither of us said a word as Osriel rushed to my side. I made a strange sound as the male gathered me up in a tight hug, his arms forcing the air from my lungs. "I'm so sorry, Kyra," he whispered. My heart stopped. His whole body was quivering, voice shaking as he spoke those lines. He pulled back and, sure enough, tears were brimming his eyes, tears of regret. I turned away, for it felt almost illegal to see like I shouldn't see such a high being in an emotional state. "Please, Kyra, look at me," he begged. The anguish in his voice forced my eyes forward, even if my heart couldn't handle it. He looked at me behind a glassy gaze, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to form speech. Eventually, he threw his head against my lap, and I could feel the tension in his jaw as he clenched it. "I'm sorry." I sat there like a stunned mullet. I had no idea what to do. Here was this great man, revered by many, crying into my lap and apologizing over and over. I was saved from doing something stupid when he finally pulled back, gripping me by my shoulders. "I had no idea it had gotten that bad," he ground out, and I could tell he was trying to keep the cracks from his voice. It took me a moment to realize that even in his most vulnerable moments, he was trying to look strong for me. "I had no idea it had taken such a toll on you, and yet I..." He stopped, gritting his teeth as he looked down. For a few moments, we sat in tense silence. "And yet where was I?" he said, his sudden rise in tone taking me by surprise. "Where was I when you were suffering, when you were so alone? I was sulking in my pretty quarters, I was moping while you were aching, because I was too damn spiteful to come out of my shell and see if you were okay. And you don't have to forgive me, I have said sorry over and over, and yet I still keep hurting you, Kyra. By now my apologies probably have no meaning. I try, Kyra, I really do, but I always end up making stupid mistakes, I always end up hurting you." He started to tremble again, the reverberations shooting through my shoulders. He tightened his grip on me. "Just know I really am sorry, Kyra," he said again. "Even if those words mean nothing to you right now, after what I've done, how I've treated you, just know I am. Just know that none of this is your fault, either. You had every right to get angry, to be upset at me. And I had the nerve to take offense. I mean, what gave me the right?" A sharp breath ripped from his throat, and he fell silent again. "I should have checked up on you from the moment I noticed your absence," he continued. "I knew something was wrong, I knew it, and yet I did nothing of it. And for what? Because of my pride. Because you'd upset me." A shaky laugh escaped him. "Gee, what a leader I am." Slowly, he raised his head, returning his gaze to me. Only then did I notice the weariness, the hurt and guilt that came with beating oneself up. "I would recognize that look anywhere. I do not expect you to forgive me, Kyra," he whispered, voice a tad steadier now. "And you have every reason not to. Hell, I can't even begin to forgive myself for the neglect I've committed. I am responsible for your well-being, and yet I failed you." His words caught in his throat again, and he fell silent. I was still aware of his hands on my shoulders, the way they would quake every now and again. I opened my mouth. I wanted to forgive him, with all my heart I wanted to forgive him and ease his pain, but where was he when I was crying like he when I too was in pain. But then I recalled what Raina had told me, about how he'd threatened his own people for my sake. Going against your own people like that would take some damn backbone. I forgive you, I mumbled quietly. But if you hurt me, don't think I'll forgive you again. With teary eyes, he lifted my hand to his mouth, leaving a soft kiss on my skin. Electricity formed at the place his soft lips met my skin, and I could feel my body warming up. The room spun, and for a moment I forgot how to breathe. I reminded myself it was just a kiss of courtesy, yet it left me feeling so. You gave a golden heart, Kyra, he muttered, standing up. He gave me a small smile. A heart much more golden than mine. Chapter 37. I'd spent the rest of the day in bed, visited every now and then by Raina, who would refill my water jug or exchange court gossip. I was thankful when nighttime approached, putting an end to such a bizarre day. Though, as expected, my dread came right back the next morning. The court was beginning to stir, and even though I was on the second story, I could still hear the distant voices and detect the strange smells with clarity. For many minutes, I debated staying in bed all day, but then I remembered Zion's little speech. He'd seemed upset yesterday, even though I hadn't overtly said anything anger-provoking, and I didn't want to risk upsetting him any more than I did. So, I made a deal with myself I'd skip the eating, but I had to attend a private lesson with Zion afterward. After many more minutes of internal debate, I finally got out of bed and got ready for the day. After about a full week of lazing around in my pajamas, it felt strange to be putting on my usual combat clothes and flattening the creases in my blue pelter. Midway through my getting ready, someone knocked at the door. "Come in," I yelled, somewhat dreading who it could be. My apprehension dissipated when a pool of golden locks rounded the door, along with a pair of bright emerald eyes. "Raina," I breathed, unable to contain my relief. She nodded and stalked towards me, taking a seat in the green velvet chair. "What are you doing here?" She shrugged. "I just wanted to check in on you. Is everything all right?" I nodded. "I'm feeling better. I've decided I'll train with Zion today. I'm still gonna skip the feasting, though." Raina nodded, an undeniable light of relief in her eyes. "Did you talk with anyone yesterday?" She prodded, eyeing me warily. I nodded. "Two people, actually, Zion and Osriel." Her eyes widened. "Osriel?" She sputtered, cringing when she realized she'd basically yelled his name. "What did he talk about?" I hesitated. Osriel's state yesterday seemed too intimate to share even with a good friend like Raina. I got the feeling Osriel wouldn't want people knowing how vulnerable he'd been, how he'd basically broken down in one of the theater's arms and cried. So I lied. It was fine. He mostly came in here to apologize. Raina blew out a breath, and I couldn't help the small smile on my face. Not quite a lie, I reminded myself. A semi-truth. What else happened? She prodded. I shrugged. Well, he kissed my hand. I stopped myself, wondering where the hell that had come from. Raina's eyes widened. He did. I nodded. I had been thinking about that gesture all night, even though I knew it was one of courtesy. I looked deep into Raina's gaze, trying to discern the thoughts behind those green eyes. Raina was never the judgmental type, and if anything, she was the only person I could confide in. So I sucked in a breath. "And I felt something, Raina," I mumbled. "And, don't get me wrong, I know the kiss was just a polite gesture, but I felt something, almost like a kind of electricity." I looked to her for guidance. Her shock quickly dissipated to something close to pity, and my stomach dropped. She gave me a sad smile. "Be careful, Kyra." I stared at her. "What?" "Be careful," she repeated, her voice soft. "We all feel that pull towards the alpha. There's something about him that draws us in, us women especially. I blushed fiercely as a retort rose to my throat. However, something close to disappointment smothered that flame. He's a true alpha, she continued. A black blood, a semi-immortal being. He's something us normal werewolf cannot handle, Kyra. He has a power that does not compare to ours. She paused. There's a reason true alphas are oft-times mateless, and many will never find a Luna in their lifetime. I swallowed the tightness in my throat. I didn't know why, but those words left a dull ache in my chest. It took me a moment to realize Raina was staring at me with pity. I forced myself to scoff. Are you saying I'm in love with him, Raina? I teased. Don't be silly. He's handsome, yes, but he's really not my type. Raina sighed, like a frustrated adult trying to teach a child something they couldn't understand without making the mistakes that came with growing up. Maybe you're right, Kyra, she muttered, standing up. She strode towards the door. Once her hand was on the handle, she stopped. Just be careful, Kyra. Please. With that, she strode out the room. I watched as she pulled the door forth, shutting it with a soft click behind her. I stared at that door for ages. I'd long left my room more to escape my thoughts than anything else. It unnerved me how Raina's words bothered me much more than they should have. Maybe I felt sorry for Osriel in the regard he would likely never find a mate, or maybe it was the thought of all those yearning girls, but something in me felt so low. So low, not even the lilting melodies of songbirds could lift my spirits, nor the warm kiss of sunlight on my face. I watched the white-flossed clouds drift across the plain blue, trying to divert my thoughts, but they always came back to that one line, we all feel that pull. Upon realizing being outside was no better than being inside, I sighed, turning to head back. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable voice of a scolding female. And that's how it is, you ungrateful brat. I whirled, my eyes widening at such cruel words. That's when I found Azure standing before the tree line, her eyes scrutinizing a small omega that sat before her. She stood proud and tall, that menacing aura radiating off her in waves. The little girl cowered in its wake, tears forming in her eyes as she trembled. Do you have any idea what would hey? I called, surprising myself along with Azure, as she turned to look at me. Her blue eyes widened at me, and I saw her falter for the briefest of moments. Committed, I forced myself to walk over, hardening my face into a scowl as I regarded her. What gave you to right to torment young Omegas? I growled, folding my arms. Her mouth opened and closed a couple of times. Stay out of this, Epsilon. She snapped, but there was something missing from her voice, that usual fire. I'll treat them however I want. Besides, you don't have context. I stepped forward, feeling a slight thrill as she made a move to step back. Even so, that thrill dwindled as her face paled, eyes widening further. Leave her alone and go, I snarled, nodding towards the young girl. She had stopped crying, staring instead at the tense exchange playing out before her. I watched as Azure seemed to stand taller, as though finding her confidence again. She opened her mouth to retort, but I beat her to it. Leave? I barked, causing her to recoil. Now? I couldn't tell if it was shock or fear written on her face, but Azure quickly gathered herself and stumbled away. She shot me what could have only been a glare, but it came across as more of a grimace on her features. I stood there for a few moments, watching her leave. As I watched her back, I didn't know how to feel. Part of me felt triumphant for putting Azure in her place, sure, but another part felt almost shameful. I'm sure she never would have reacted the way she did had we never had that fight, that it was nothing but fear fueling her actions. It wasn't out of respect, or even authority. Just fear. I looked down towards the girl, who also seemed to freeze like a deer in the headlights under my stare. I felt my eyes prickle with guilt, I'd always wanted people to respect me, listen to me, but not out of fear. Never out of fear. I looked back to where I'd last seen Azure, but now she was long gone from sight. I felt tears of shame welling in my ducts. Not like this, I said to myself. I don't want you to fear me. I don't want anyone to fear me. Chapter 38 Epsilon. Zion asked, almost surprised. I give him a nod. I didn't think you'd turn up. A smug smirk crossed his face. To what do I owe this pleasure? I shrugged, forcing a smirk to my lips despite the sadness still roiling inside. My encounter with Azure had only been 20 minutes ago, and yet her fearful reaction of me still hurt. I don't know, Lord Zion. I guess you could say I missed your company. The male rolled his eyes with a scoff. You're a terrible liar, Epsilon. And you're a terrible actor, I quipped back, frowning. You left my room like I'd done something to upset you, but now I realize that isn't the case. He stared at me for a moment before scoffing. Not only are you a bad liar, but you're an overthinker. Please, Epsilon, pick a struggle. There's only so much I can deal with. I sighed. Despite my sadness, I couldn't help but feel lifted by our back-and-forth banter. It was good to have things back to the way they were, even if there was still a little tension in the air. Smiling, I returned my gaze to his. What will we be doing today? I could have sworn excitement flashed through those stone-cut eyes. Today, Epsilon, we are going to try discover your unique ability. I started. So soon. The male cocked an auburn brow. You seem shocked, Epsilon, his mouth curved into a devious smile. Afraid. I barked a laugh. You wish. But in reality, I was scared. It seemed Zion and I's strange connection had sustained itself after all, and I didn't want to ruin it by disappointing him now. It seemed Zion read my thoughts, though, for he gave me a surprisingly soft smile. Do not fret. I don't plan on a screaming match today. I understand this topic is difficult. I blinked. Zion. Saying he doesn't want to fight. Admitting that a skill was actually difficult to master. I stared at him. Who are you and what have you done with the red-headed prick? Seeing my disbelief, he waved me away. Besides, I don't want to listen to your whining, it gives me a headache. I shrugged. Fine by me. He waved at me to begin, so, smiling, I closed my eyes, focusing on the buzz in the air around me. I drew it into me, as easily as one would draw in air. I allowed it to penetrate my skin, energizing my muscles and thrumming through my bones. My senses sharpened, and after a few moments of slight trembling, I opened my golden eyes. What now? I want you to focus all that energy onto one spot in your body, he instructed. Any spot, it just has to be concentrated into a small area for this to work. All right. I said, uncertainty lacing my tone. Shutting my eyes, I directed the energy to my right palm. My hand felt slightly uncomfortable with so much energy drumming underneath it, but I tried to push the discomfort out of my head. Now what? Can you feel anything different? He began. Anything at all? I paused, allowing myself to analyze the concentrated pool of energy in my palm. The skin of my palm was beginning to sweat, and my hand was really starting to ache with the weight of the red-hot magic. Feel something. I thought to myself. What does he want me to feel? No, I said finally. No, I can't. The male remained silent for a few moments. Nothing at all. No, just a lot of pain. Zion, what is this supposed to do? What am I meant to feel? I heard him blow out a breath. Concentrating your lunar magic into one place should allow you to feel your affinity towards one of the 4 abilities, but obviously you're not at that point yet. His words held no anger, not even the disappointment I was anticipating, but they still hurt me all the same. Hearing that I wasn't at the right level he expected of me hurt my pride. I knew I shouldn't be so hard on myself, that I had only been a werewolf for such a small time, but part of me also believed I should meet everyone's expectations by now. I had spent more than enough time suffering at the low levels, at places far beneath what everyone else had expected of me. That thinking wasn't good for me, I knew, but I couldn't help it. I had always been a competitive and prideful soul, so this dish of reality was a hard slap to the face. We continued for hours, and I was very surprised by Zion's patience, even when mine started to wear thin. Zion must have sensed my defeat, because he shot me affirmation after affirmation, that it would come to me in time, or that I would master it eventually. They were words very foreign to my ears, especially coming from the likes of him. It was only once the sun had hit the tip of the trees did we call it a day. Oh, and Epsilon, he started as soon as I'd turned to leave. Everything ached and I wanted nothing more than to flop onto my bed and brood. Even so, I turned to give him my full attention. He deserved it considering how patient he'd been today, even with my disappointing progress. The Alpha wishes to see you whenever you are free. He said he tried to catch you in your quarters this morning, but by the time he'd arrived, you were gone. He paused at my dumbfounded silence. So, he began, exasperated. Are you free this evening? Snapping from my stupor, I nodded. Yes, I stammered. Tell him I'll meet him in the courtyard. A small smile crept upon Zion's lips as he nodded. I turned on my heel to walk away. Kyra, wait, he called. I stopped in my tracks, frozen as he grabbed my wrist and whirled me around. As quickly as he'd done it, he jerked his hand away, clutching it as though I'd burnt him. As he stared down at me, several emotions passed through his eyes: shock, disbelief, then finally sorrow. I frowned at him, noticing that the air between us had shifted significantly. He mumbled something I couldn't decipher, and before I had an inch to ask him to repeat himself or explain what the hell just happened, he whirled on his heel and stalked away. I stared at his back in bewilderment. What the hell was that? But as I watched him scuttle away, I realized it wasn't just his behavior that struck me as odd. For once, he'd addressed me by my name, my real name. Chapter 39. I stood in the courtyard, picking at my nails as I waited for the Alpha's appearance. It was a nervous habit I needed to kick, especially if I didn't want to seem like a target in front of all these people. I frowned towards the people sending me strange looks, the way they glanced away quicker than I could process their expressions. It was odd, but I found my mind drifting to Jane and her cronies. I wonder what she'd think of me now, of the insults she'd say. Could she even insult me now? I was far prettier than her, thanks to my lunar magic, and I could feel the air of confidence that surrounded me. I wondered what Aelia would think, too. I swallowed the tightness in my throat. I couldn't help but wonder how Aelia was faring now that I'd gone. She was likely facing those bullies alone, without me jumping in front of her all the time like a shield. I thought back to her bubbly features and sweet personality. I knew she was on the spectrum, even if she'd never told me herself. It was the little things that gave it away, like her oversensitivity to sounds, and the way she could never seem to maintain eye contact unless it was me. It only made me want to protect her more, and this world was unforgiving, so the fact I wasn't there to do so scared me more than anything. Are you ready? Came a silky voice behind. I whirled, meet with the smirking face of Osriel. I had been so lost in my thoughts, I hadn't even heard his approach. His azure eyes snared me like they always did, glimmering like midnight candles. His smile did strange things to my stomach, and I had to look away. Get a hold of yourself, what is wrong with you? I chastised. I cleared my throat, looking up at him again with a sweet smile. Yes, I'm ready. He offered me his arm again, and without a second's hesitation, I took it in my own. I wasn't surprised by the odd glances thrown my way, along with the jealousy that seemed to radiate off many of the girls. I recalled what Raina had said, how they all felt a pull towards the alpha. I scoffed at the idea. Maybe they were in love with him, but I wasn't. He was way out of my league, even with my newfound beauty and power. Together we trekked through the winding halls of the court and into the back fields, where I could spy the tree line from afar. Something in my stomach stirred at the thought of being alone in a forest with Osriel, but I pushed the feeling out of my head. Steadily, we walked towards the tree line, drinking up the sunlight that was bearing down on us. The wind was warm upon my skin, the scent of wild tulip and oak getting stronger with every step we took towards the forest. It wasn't long before we were lost within the thicket of the trees, dodging tree roots and kicking pebbles. We trekked most of the way in silence. The silence made me feel so tense, I thought I would implode. Osriel, however, didn't seem bothered at all. In fact, he has a constant small smile on his lips. Though, given his age, I supposed it made sense that he was used to walking in painfully awkward silence. Out of nowhere, he broke the silence. Today, Kyra dear, we are going to discover your unique ability. My head whipped towards him. My unique ability? I asked, dumbfounded. He nodded. Well, don't expect much of me, I warned. I already trained with Zion, and to say it was a disaster would be an understatement. The man huffed a chuckle. You'll achieve it in good time. Besides, Kyra, he shot me a coy look. You'll be training with me. No offense to Zion, but his methods can be a bit stagnant. At times. I stifled a chuckle, and we fell into silence again. I focused on the cold grass licking the soles of my feet, a tantalizing relief to the heat rushing in fierce rays through the clearing. I tuned into the songbirds screeching in the distance, the cicadas that clicked their deafening melodies. I didn't want to stare at the man next to me, or rather, I didn't have the nerve to. After a few moments, he shot me a sideways glance. Is there anything you wish to ask, Kyra dear? Now would be the time. I pondered, glad for a reason to break the silence. Yes, I stammered, swallowing the tightness in my throat. I was aware of the way he stared intently at my temple, but I kept my eyes firmly to the ground. Despite myself, there was a question I was burning to have answered. I have a couple of questions, if that's okay. I looked to him for reassurance, and being the gentleman he was, he nudged me on with a small smile. I cleared my throat and stared at the ground, feeling slightly embarrassed by what I was about to ask. You know how my family and friends forgot about me, because of the werewolf curse or whatever. I slid my eyes to him. I had been debating this one for a while, ever since I found out human memories could be wiped. He nodded, so, blowing out a long breath, I continued, well, I had this one friend back in the human world, my best friend. I get the feeling she would accept me for who I am now, even if it took her some time. And I was wondering if you could reverse the memory loss. He finished. I closed my mouth, nodding. My cheeks burned as I realized how stupid of a question that was to ask. Not only was the memory loss likely irreversible, but if it was, there was no way I'd be allowed to let a human know of my identity. The Wolven blessing existed for a reason. Yes, there is a way. It's difficult, but it's possible. My eyes snapped to him, mouth falling open. There is. I stammered. How? How can it be done? Well, lucky for you, it requires emotional magic, which you have. However, it's a difficult thing to pull off, and it's not a well-known method. Then teach me, I urged. Teach me how to do it. I would give anything to see Ailey again. Kyra, he began, hesitating. It's not that simple. This is a skill that cannot be taught, at least not easily. It takes decades to master. Besides, I'm not sure we could risk introducing a human to the werewolf world. Do you know how to do it? I interrupted, ignoring him. Osriel seemed to hesitate for a moment. Well, yes, I know how, but I can't pull it off since I don't have an affinity to emotional magic. In saying that, I could guide you how to do it through a bond. What kind of bond? I urged. Osriel hesitated again. An alpha-beta bond, an alpha-zeta bond. A mate bond. The air around us stilled. Osriel was the first to break the silence. Anyways, Kyra, as I said, I don't think it's a good idea to introduce a human to the werewolf world. Osriel, I interrupted. I know Aelia. She would understand. In time, I know she would accept me, I know she would. Osriel seemed to ponder the notion. Then, after many moments of tense silence, he sighed. Well, all right, but first you'll need to build up your emotional magic reserves, and discovering your unique ability is a good start. We can figure out the whole bond thing later, I'm sure I can find a way. My heart leaped out of my chest. Before I knew it, I was barreling into Osriel, my arms wrapping tightly around his frame. Thank you. I yelled. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I won't let you down, and neither will Aelia, I promise. I felt his smile rather than saw it. Slowly, I climbed off him, my cheeks heating at the realization of what I had just done. Way to make yourself look like a stumbling fangirl, idiot, I thought to myself. So, Osriel began, obviously a bit shocked himself. What was your other question? I thought. Am I the only type of werewolf with, you know, emotional magic? I rushed, peering at him beneath my curtain of hair. He blinked towards me, an emotionless expression on his face, as he stared at the sky. My heart sunk as I thought I'd asked a bad question, but before I could turn into an overthinking mess, Osriel spoke. Yes, there are two other types of wolves with emotional magic, he gave me a sideways glance. Do you want to know about them? I nodded eagerly, my eyes wide. He sighed through his nose. I probably should have told you this far back, Kyra, but I didn't want to scare you. I furrowed my brows. What could possibly scare me now? The silence dragged on for a few more moments, and I squirmed in discomfort. Osriel's expression was hard and emotionless, very different from the carefree alpha I'd seen moments before. I found myself wishing for him back. There's another type of wolf with emotional affinity, Kyra, one that can only be created by the bite of an epsilon. My heart sunk at the words. I swallowed. What are they called? Osriel was silent for a moment. Upsilons. There's no other way to put it, they are savages, killing machines. They run purely off emotional magic which, my friend, is dangerous. There is no trace of lunar magic in them. They listen to whoever holds power over them, and will kill anything they deem right to die. They are dangerous and very unstable. I nodded, swallowing the bile in my throat. Is that why everyone hates me? Osriel considered for a moment before shaking his head. No, the general public don't know about the existence of upsilons, and we intend to keep it that way. I blew out a breath. I was disliked as much as it was. I couldn't imagine how people would view me if they knew I could create these savages. And the other type? I prodded. Osriel's azure eyes darkened. Deltas, he ground out, and I fell silent, suddenly eager to change the subject. I had never seen Osriel so tense when talking about something. His jaw was clenched, and I could see the muscles in his neck straining under the pressure. There's only one known in this area. You'll know it's a delta because he has two different colored eyes, one purple and one orange. A delta, otherwise known as the solstice wolf, represents a perfect balance between lunar and emotional energy, hence why one eye is purple and the other is not. Purple eyes always represent emotional magic. Kyra, you have them. I pondered. That explained the purple tainted vision I got whenever I dug into my emotional magic. I never considered that my eyes may have been changing color, though. I'd always assumed they were gold. Within him, the lunar energy and emotional energy are constantly fighting for dominance. He is a barely contained storm, he continued, voice grave. If either side is to be knocked out of balance, the results are disastrous. If you ever see him, Kyra, you run. No one wolf can compare to his power. The forest spun. There was a wolf stronger than Osriel. I found that hard to believe. The light quickly returned to his azure eyes, and he nodded ahead. Ah, would you look at that, we are here. I followed his gaze and was met with a very familiar clearing. Osriel dropped my arm, rounding to stand before me. Right, Kyra, that's enough talking, he chirped, as though he hadn't just been talking in a deadly tone. Let's train, shall we? If you enjoy Kyra's story, don't forget to subscribe, more excitement is coming.